In holding scientific research and discovery in respect, as we should, we must also be alert to the equal and opposite danger that public policy could itself become the captive of a scientific, technological elite.
We are, along with the rest of humanity, facing the dire and growing threat of the climate crisis.
We have now entered, as the world has industrialized, a period of rapid warming of the planet.
Our planet is changing in ways that will have profound impacts on all of humankind.
The world is getting warmer. Carbon dioxide is a very strong greenhouse gas.
The last decade, year, and month are all the hottest on record.
Human-initiated climate change is also contributing to extreme weather events.
I'm here to say we need to act.
And each day that we wait, we increase the risk that we will leave our children and grandchildren an irreparably damaged planet.
Scientific, technological elite. The scientific, technological elite.
Our next story, global warming. Not a story, but really a heated debate that's continuing because some scientists claim that there's no credible data to support the fact that the Earth is actually warming up.
Well, global warming skeptics are holding their own meeting on the sidelines of the UN's climate conference in Copenhagen.
A lot of people are changing their minds about the theory of man-made global warming.
Some say global warming wasn't proved scientifically.
Most of the mainstream media has embraced the theory of man-made global warming.
Their whole message is one of fear-mongering.
Scary stuff makes for good stories.
This year, the Arctic ice cover has increased by 40%. Well, you won't read about that in the newspapers.
35,000 homes are at risk from rising sea levels and tides.
Rising sea levels is a great tool to throw a scare into people.
Polar bear population in danger of extinction.
Polar bears have been increasing in numbers.
More extreme droughts, floods, wildfires, and hurricanes.
The bottom line is what the data says is that there is no increase in extreme weather activity.
Since 2001, 9 of the 10 warmest years in the history of the planet has been recorded.
The Earth has been here 4.5 billion years.
For the last 16 years, there has been no global warming, even though the concentration of CO2 has risen.
Computer models did not anticipate the fact that it hasn't warmed for the last 10 years or so.
In other words, CO2 is not the tail that wags the dog.
There's so many different theories as to what is causing the Earth to change.
What is changing the climate? And I will tell you that it's the...
Trillions are involved in the oil and gas industry.
Funding a network of groups to challenge the existence of global warming.
There isn't any funding by big oil. There's no money coming in.
We've never received a nickel.
One of the die-hard arguments is the idea that all scientists agree that there's this huge consensus. And that just doesn't hold up.
The greatest threat is that global warming pollution will continue unabated.
Global warming is accelerating.
They say the debate is over.
We've never actually had the debate.
All we want is a debate.
The debate is skeptical, but not denial. You guys are over. The debate is over.
Everybody's gone mad.
Environmentalism has been taken over.
In order to push a political agenda.
And I call it scientific fascism.
And this is the greatest debate ever.
We've declared war on climate change.
What I want to present today and here is the anthropogenic global warming. That is, humans are causing global warming because of the addition of CO2 to the atmosphere. And the hypothesis then is that CO2 is a gas that traps heat in the Earth's atmosphere, and that if the CO2 increases, the temperature will rise. And of course, they then assume that the CO2 will increase because human activities, particularly industrial, will increase. And therefore, on the basis of that, they are predicting that the world is going to warm.
I want to do what is right then. If this global warming is truly a crisis, and if human beings are truly causing it, then we genuinely have a responsibility to do something about it. I investigated the data and found that we have a political movement here.
Polar bears on the shrinking Arctic ice, victims of global warming.
Today, I am listing the polar bear as a threatened species under the Endangered Species Act.
Today, a huge milestone by the Bush administration. Polar bears were declared a threatened species.
I was invited by the U.S. Senate committee to testify on this matter, and that's when I reviewed the reports by the government on why there would be a decrease in the number of polar bears over time.
As stated, the primary problem we're looking at today is what might happen to polar bears in the future. So I'm addressing this committee as an expert on forecasting.
It turns out that if the evidence that we have indicates that over the last few decades, polar bears have been increasing in numbers. And they've been increasing in numbers because of restrictions on hunting. So in the face of this data, increasing polar bear population, the government managed to come up with a forecast that the population would decrease rapidly.
We asked, did the author's procedures follow scientific principles?
We did an audit of their procedures, and we found they violated roughly 80% of the principles. And they also were not very cooperative when we asked them for the data they used on polar bears. They said they would not provide it, and the reason was because they're using it. It was pretty clear that it was a political issue.
Polar bears were heavily hunted throughout a good portion of the 20th century, and even before, to the point where in the early 1960s, the polar bear population was down in the neighborhood of 4,000 or 5,000, and they truly were on the verge of going extinct. In about 1973, 72, there was an international treaty signed between Norway, the then Soviet Union, United States, and other countries that banned a lot of polar bear hunting. Since that time, polar bear populations have grown strongly. So today, we have a standing polar bear population of about 25,000, somewhere between 20 and 30,000 individuals. So the population in the past 40 years, when all of this global warming is supposed to be taking place, is actually quadrupled or increased fivefold. That borders on a population explosion. That's not a decrease.
This shows you the Arctic ice. There's the North Pole right at the center here. You can see Greenland and Hudson Bay and Hudson Straits. This is the winter. This is the midwinter. And you can see that there's approximately 15 million square kilometers of ice at midwinter. But here is August of the same year. Look at the extent of the ice. And what's happened here is that every summer, at least 10 million square kilometers of ice melts, an area equal to the United States. That's normal. Every single year that happens. And hardly anybody knows that. It's a melt rate of 67,000 square kilometers. Right? That's every single day. 67,000 square kilometers of ice melts. It's an area the size of West Virginia. Melts every single day. But can you see the headlines in the New York Times? Where it says, oh, an area of Arctic ice the size of West Virginia melted today. It's the end of the world. No, it isn't. It's normal.
The entire North Polar ice cap during some of the summer months could be completely ice-free within the next 5 to 7 years. The entire Arctic ice cap, which for most of the last 3 million years has covered an area the size of the lower 48 states, may completely and totally disappear in summer in as little as 5 years.
This is what would happen to the sea level in Florida. This is what would happen to San Francisco Bay. A lot of people live in these areas. The Netherlands, one of the low countries, absolutely devastating. The area around Beijing that's home to tens of millions of people. Even worse, in the area around Shanghai, there are 40 million people. Worse still, Calcutta and to the east, Bangladesh, the area covered includes 60 million people.
So Al Gore said it was going to be 20 feet sea level rise, but he didn't say anything when. Is sea level rising? There's no question of sea level rise. We're coming out of an ice age, right? I mean, when we had the ice age, sea level was, 20, 30 feet lower than it is right now.
So from 1850 through today, 163 years, sea level has risen about 7.5 inches. And that comes out to what? About 0.05 of an inch per year. Actually less than 0.05 of an inch per year. And the predictions that some people are pushing these days are that the sea level is going to rise something like 12 inches in the next 7 years. That's about a 40-fold increase. So that's a wild prediction, and it's worse than that. It's not consistent with recent history at all.
They're telling you, oh, the sea level is going to rise. But in fact, what's been happening is you see in the last about 8,000 years, increase of the sea level has actually leveled off. Here's 20,000 years ago. You see on this left side, look at the sea level. It went up about 400 feet in the last 10,000 years.
Everybody that has looked at the data cannot find an acceleration. But the global warming enthusiast is forecasting acceleration. And it's very unfortunate. Sea level will continue to rise, there's no question about it, but it's not accelerating. End of story.
Historically, geologically, we have had temperature changes that dwarf the ones we're facing today. And in the face of that, these people are claiming sea level changes that dwarf the ones we faced during those much more erratic times.
Al Gore said, sea level was going to rise and inundate all these cities, and said he built a huge multi-million-dollar house right next to the ocean. So he really wasn't believing his own story.
In a world that's getting warmer than it used to be, all weather events are affected by it. More extreme droughts, floods, wildfires, and hurricanes.
So let's look at the actual facts. Hurricanes at or low 30, 40-year historic lows for tropical cyclone activity. We're going on now 7 or 8 years since a major Category 3 or larger landfalling hurricane has hit the United States. The longest period, the 8 years, since 1900 or earlier. Some say since the Civil War, some say since at least 1900. So the best way to say it is there's a dearth of hurricane activity. Then you look at droughts and floods. Well, in the peer-reviewed literature, floods go back in 127 years, show no trend. Droughts are actually on a declining trend. 2012 drought wasn't as bad as the 1980s drought, which wasn't as bad as the 1950s drought, which wasn't as bad as the 1930s drought. Big tornadoes, F3 and larger, are down dramatically since the 1950s. And we know those are consistent because you don't need radar and Doppler to know if an F3 or larger tornado hits. That's a pretty devastating thing.
The only thing that's increased is the one storm they said we'd see less of, the snowstorm. They predicted that snow would be a very rare event for most cities in the big cities of mid-latitudes. Instead, London's been buried 5 years in a row by snow. We've had big snowstorms in the eastern United States. In the hemisphere, 4 of the 5 snowiest winters on record have occurred in the last 6 years.
We had record-setting snowstorms in the eastern United States the past couple years ago. I believe the name the media coined was Snowmageddon. And then they turned around a week later and said, well, that's a result of global warming. The theory that explains everything, in fact, explains nothing.
They predict global warming will cause more snow in the winter, global warming will cause less snow. Global warming will cause more drought, global warming will cause less drought.
I think that's why they changed the name from global warming to climate change, because now any event, cold weather, hot weather, storm, flood, freezes, drought, can be attributed to man-made climate change.
They keep talking about climate change as if this is something bad, but climate changes, and it's very difficult to argue that you can't stop it, really. They seem to think that human activity can stop it from changing altogether, and it can't be done. And the problem is that it's not really forecastable. You can't really be sure what's going to happen next.
Barbara Boxer, the head of the Environment and Public Works Committee, has said recently that we need to address the climate. We need a carbon tax or cap and trade because we have to prevent all these storms. We have to stop the floods and droughts, as though an act of Congress or the United Nations can control the weather.
The official scientific view
that promotes global warming alarmism is really not based on science or on data. It's based on computer modeling.
Computer models.
Computer models.
Forecasting models. Computer models on global warming.
Computer models. Computer models.
Forecasting model.
Computer models.
The problem with the computer models is that although they have lots of interesting uses and they're very powerful, they can't forecast the future. They cannot predict what the temperature is going to be in 10 years, 50 years, or 100 years. And you see this from the model runs that were done in the 1990s that predicted that we would see significant increases in the global mean temperature by now. And yet, for the last 15 years or so, the global mean temperature has been flat.
The only way you can test a model is to compare its results with actual measurements. And when they do that, they find that there are really serious problems with climate models.
Computer models are faulty because they will admit to a very poor understanding of some of the very important factors: clouds, water vapor, the solar effect, ocean cycles. Yet they still manage to claim that they have 90% or greater certainty in what the models are telling them. And that's, of course, not possible and not reasonable and not validated by the actual data, which shows that temperatures have been flat for going on 17 years, even though CO2 has gone up 10% during that time period.
This is a very simple diagram of how the computer models are supposed to work. They divide the world up into rectangles, as you can see here, and then, of course, they put into that a mathematical formula representing the weather in each of those rectangles. And then they do that for above the surface. So it becomes a cube above the surface piled up, different heights. But here's the problem. We got no data for over 80% of the world. What data are they putting into those squares? And when we get above the surface, we got even less data. We know virtually nothing about what's going on above the surface of the Earth. And so what are you building your model on? Well, what they tell you is they say, well, yeah, we don't have the data, but we use parameterization. And if that sounds like a cooked word, it is. It's a word for saying we're making it up as we go along.
We subjected the IPCC scenarios to our forecasting audit, and there was 89 principles that were, out of the 140 that were relevant to climate change forecasting. Of the 89, I believe it was 72 that they violated. Now imagine that you were a doctor and you violated many principles, even one. That's not a good idea.
For anyone to say they have a computer model that can accurately predict what's going to happen in the future is pure nonsense.
So we're talking about the day-to-day weather, and as we've already said, predicting that out beyond 4 to 5 days is virtually impossible. Why? Because it's essentially chaotic. It's essentially chaotic.
The science that really tells us about climate change more than meteorology is geology, because geology tells us what actually happened in the past. It's not based upon theoretical computer models that can be tweaked and fudge factors can be introduced. And if a model doesn't produce something we like, we can go back and change any one of 40 subjective factors. Geology tells us what actually happened in the past.
The so-called skeptics will sometimes say, oh, this whole thing, this is a cyclical phenomenon. There was a medieval warming period after all. Well, yeah, there was. There it is right there. There are two others. But compared to what's going on now, there's just no comparison.
The medieval warm period is a period in Europe that's well documented. There are something like at least 200 scientific research papers that were published documenting its existence. And so when you look at the temperature record and you see that temperature today is no higher than the medieval warm period, it kind of takes all of the scariness out of the global warming theory.
This graph appeared in the first two Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change reports, but it created a problem because it contradicted their argument that, oh, this is warmer than it's ever been. When the Vikings were sailing in Arctic waters that are now permanent pack ice, where the Vikings are setting up settlements in northern Newfoundland at Lanceau Meadow and generally moving around the whole of the northern hemisphere in areas that you can't get into now.
In 1995, I'm sitting at my desk and I received what I thought was an astonishing email from a person I would describe as a major researcher in the area of global warming and climate change. And what he said in the email was, he said, quote, "We have to get rid of the medieval warm period," unquote. And I was just astonished when I read that, because I thought our job as scientists and researchers is not to alter the historical temperature record to suit some sort of ideology or political agenda, but it was to go out and discover what had actually happened and then tell people. And so what they had to do was, in effect, exactly what I was told. They had to get rid of the medieval warming period. And a few years after I was told that is when we first saw the appearance of the infamous hockey stick record, which completely rewrote all of the scientific articles and research that had been published in the preceding decades on what the temperature record of the last 1,000 years was. And all of a sudden now, it was completely flat or declining temperature up into the 20th century when it shot up like a spike, and thus the name hockey stick, because the graph resembled the shape of a hockey stick.
ClimateGate. 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 ClimateGate.
ClimateGate.
ClimateGate.
ClimateGate.
ClimateGate. ClimateGate. ClimateGate.
So ClimateGate was the name given to the release of emails from the University of East Anglia in the United Kingdom. And that happened in November of 2009. Either a whistleblower or a hacker, the person's never been found, released a couple thousand emails.
Thousands of hacked emails and thousands of private email messages and documents had been stolen from its climate center.
The documents were then made available to the public from a Russian server.
The affairs made many people more skeptical about whether humans are really changing the climate.
A top scientist caught up in the scandal stepping down.
Here's the first one. The fact is that we can't account for the lack of warming.
Bill Jones, who just resigned, said, "I've just completed Mike's nature trip and he goes on and he talks about to hide the decline in temperatures.
I can't see either of these papers being in the next IPCC report. Kevin and I will keep them out somehow, even if we have to redefine what the peer review literature is."
The reason that certain people wanted to, as they say, get rid of the medieval warm period was to alter the historical temperature record so that present-day temperatures would seem anomalously warm. And when you take the present-day temperatures and put them in a historical context, then you begin to realize what we're going through at the present time is entirely within the range of natural variation.
But here's the ice core record from Antarctica. And what it shows is the temperature change of the planet over the last 420,000 years. And it starts, the present time is up here on this left side. Here's the current temperature of the Earth. And then you go back 120,000 years and you see the Earth was warmer 120,000 years ago than it is today. But what the overall record shows you is that in the last 420,000 years, there have only been 5 warm periods. That the majority of that 420,000 years, the world's been much colder than it currently is. You can see here, it's pushing 12 degrees Celsius change in temperature over that cycle. And yet they're trying to tell you, oh, the world's going to warm up by 1 degree and it's going to be the end of the world. And you'd say, well, no, hang on a minute. Let's put this data into context.
What the EPA did under Lisa Jackson, President Obama's administrator for the EPA, they ruled that carbon dioxide emissions endanger public health and safety, and therefore must be regulated under the Clean Air Act.
CO2 is not a toxic gas. It is something that we cannot survive without. As a child, we learned that the CO2 cycle is important. Animals breathe out CO2. At the same time, plants must have it in order to grow. So this alarmism about increases in CO2 is totally wrong.
If we did not have CO2 in the Earth's atmosphere, there would be no life on Earth.
They're now absolutely convinced, they've got the evidence, that the Earth is now greener than it used to be. And part of the reason is that there's a bit more carbon dioxide because more plants grow with carbon dioxide. So it's very far from being a pollutant. I mean, I'm against pollution in general, which is to say if the air or the water has got subjects in it which are harmful or unpleasant, and let's get rid of them. But carbon dioxide isn't unpleasant. I mean, we breathe it out all the time.
If you go to a hothouse where they're growing flowers, what do they pump in to make the flowers grow so they're ready for Valentine's Day? They pump in CO2.
I would join the movement and be in it if I believed that CO2 is doing the damage they say it is. It certainly isn't.
They stop talking about CO2 and they start talking about carbon pollution. Now, it's morphed into that.
Carbon pollution, carbon pollution, carbon pollution, carbon pollution.
What is carbon pollution? It's not this invisible beneficial gas anymore. That's soot that they're talking about. But the EPA's own analysis show that the particulate matter in the air, small and large, 2.5 and 10 microns, have decreased 30% in the last 2 or 3 decades. So soot is going down, not up. It's not a problem. It's not a reason to shut down all power plants and sit in the dark.
The National Climate Action Plan I unveiled will cut carbon pollution, protect our country from the impacts of climate change, and lead the world in a coordinated assault on a changing climate.
There is one relationship that is far more powerful than all the others, and it is this. When there is more carbon dioxide, the temperature gets warmer because it traps more heat from the sun inside.
The fundamental assumption is that a CO2 increase causes a temperature increase. The difficulty is that that doesn't occur anywhere in the record. This is the ice core record with the temperature variation, and then it's plotted against the CO2. And I remember when this first came out in 1991 with Petit and Jouzel and the French researchers, and they warned, they said, don't rush to judgment on this. But of course, everybody grabbed it because, oh yeah, there it is, the temperature's going up and down, the CO2 is going up and down. So they assumed that the CO2, this was proof it was driving their temperature. 5 years later, we discovered is exactly the opposite, that the temperature changes before the CO2. In other words, the most important assumption of their hypothesis is wrong.
CO2 rises after the temperature rises. It doesn't precede the warming, doesn't cause the warming. It occurs because of the warming.
It's absolutely clear that in the past, the temperature always went up first before the CO2 went up, every single case.
As the atmosphere gets warmer, the warm spell develops. A few hundred years later, then the CO2 builds in that warm air to a higher level. But it's not the other way around, where the CO2 builds and that drives the temperature up. It's as the air warms up, it can hold more CO2, so more CO2 stays in the atmosphere.
Scientists are increasingly becoming disenchanted, and a large number of very high-profile physicists have come out, even Nobel Prize winners, and denounced global warming as the greatest scam in scientific history.
For the last 16 years, there has been no global warming, even though the concentration of CO2 has risen.
We haven't seen any global warming on average for 16 years now. That is completely the opposite of what we were led to believe was going to happen or was already happening.
We've had no warming for 17 years. The last 16 years, we have had no global warming.
The temperature has not gone up over the last about 15 years.
For the last 16 years, we've had a plateau.
It is true that we've had at least 10 years of flat temperatures. And by the way, none of the computer models that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change relies on has predicted this hiatus in global surface temperatures.
Now we come to a period of flat temperatures for the past 17 years, and the head of the IPCC says, oh, it's just a pause. And I say to him, excuse me, you talked about this incredible force and now you're talking about a pause? Come on.
When you start to look at CO2, it's not even an important gas in terms of total in the atmosphere. It's even less as a greenhouse gas. But they've tried to get around that by saying, oh, well, it's more effective. It's not as much volume, but it's more effective as a greenhouse gas. There's no evidence to support that at all.
The really significant thing about that is that it's causing even some of the mainstream scientists to reassess what's called climate sensitivity, how much warming you get from a given increase in atmospheric greenhouse gases. It's the high sensitivity estimates that drive these outlandish doomsday scenarios.
So here you see from 1983 to 1997, this was the amount of CO2 that humans produced. But here, we produced 100 billion tons more, but the temperature went down. So it's not just that the CO2 is not right, it's the human CO2 that doesn't match the evidence.
And when you trace the history of that research, you find that the very man who started that research, a great scientist named Roger Revelle, that man who put out the first modern paper on CO2 as a global warming element, backed off 10 years later and said, wait a minute, we don't find that this is really a significant warming that's going on here. He co-wrote an article for the new science magazine called Cosmos at the time, in which he said, hold on a minute, this global warming thing, this carbon dioxide thing, it's not valid. But in the meantime, he had no other than Al Gore as a student in one of his classes at Harvard, and Al Gore had picked up on this global warming thing, and it became an absolute cornerstone of his life. So there we are, folks, a fallacy, bad science, and the scientists who started it backed off on it.
Hundreds of factors impact global temperatures. And the idea that they isolate one on the margin, CO2, they try to regulate that one factor out of 100 and then think that our input, we can have some kind of impact that would somehow control temperatures, is not sustainable in the peer-reviewed literature. It's not sustainable in the scientific scientific realm at all. In other words, CO2 is not the tail that wags the dog.
And so this diagram shows you a very, very simple diagram of the atmospheric processes. You can see different parts. You've got the sunlight, solar radiation coming in at the top, and you've got ocean input here, and everything in between. And how would you start to model this? How would you start to hypothesize about what's going on or what's controlling this? Well, if this is the complexity of the weather, and any one of these things can cause a change in the weather, why have they focused only on CO2?
All the thinking that we're doing is all linear thinking. What do you mean by linear thinking, right? It means that, you put more CO2 in the air, it's going to absorb some heat, so the heat's not going to get away very fast, right? That's simple linear thinking, okay? The climate system is an extremely non-linear system.
We're going to look back on this and wonder how in the world could we have been so gullible to believe that this little amount of CO2 could bring about these tremendous climate changes when there's so many other components that are of much greater magnitude from energy points of view.
So obviously this is not CO2, but that leaves us with the crucial question: what is changing the climate? And I will tell you that it's the sun changing the climate.
The most important influence on climate is the one that drives the weather every day, and that's the sun. And people who deny the sun has a role in climate, the sun, how could it possibly affect the climate? Well, isn't it warmer in the afternoon after several hours of sunshine than it was early in the morning? 20 or 30 degrees? Isn't it warmer in the summer when the sun is higher in the sky and shining for many more hours than it is in the winter? It affects the Earth.
There's so many different theories as to what is causing the Earth to change and the climate and this and that. But now, an important new scientific study actually suggests that the leading cause of the climate change may actually just be the sun, not human beings.
On Mars, the polar caps, which are frozen CO2, have receded when the Earth has warmed, and that certainly at least is an indication, maybe not proof, but an indication that it's the sun that's doing it, and it's affecting all of the planets. Clearly, there's a link we don't fully understand or have not yet proven, but it seems to be there.
The sun reached a peak of activity around 2000. Then the ice caps, which are either water or carbon dioxide, started to melt on other planets. And of course, people were saying, well, there's no CO2 there. It's not varying. There's no human production of it. Yet the ice caps are melting. So obviously that's to do with the sun. And of course, this then contradicted their argument that the sun had nothing to do with it. That's why the interplanetary weather patterns became important.
Something is amplifying the solar signal a factor of 5 to 7 times. And that amplifying factor fits beautifully with the changes in clouds. So clouds is probably very likely the amplifying factor that connects solar activity and climate on Earth.
Svensmark is among the leaders in this solar study.
Svensmark's theory has been strengthened significantly by the cloud results.
The Svensmark theory has been validated in the laboratory, and it's been validated in the atmosphere.
What that tells you immediately, the very fact that people are testing these types of theories tells you that the science is not settled.
CERN, CERN, one of the world's largest and most prestigious centers for scientific research, has concluded that it's the sun's rays, not human activity, which controls the Earth's climate.
We've made a number of first observations of some very important processes that may be going on in the atmosphere. And what we found is that cosmic rays do significantly enhance the production of these particles.
Yes, we've done experiments, and the experiments seem to support this idea that cosmic rays somehow are involved in the climate on Earth.
You know how long it took to get this cloud experiment going, and Svensmark and Friis Christensen in Denmark had proceeded on their own and were barely recognized here. This is a grave threat to the biggest gravy train big science and, frankly, big academia has seen in decades. They're not just going to raise their hands and say, you know what, we were wrong.
We have learned during the last 10, 15 years that the sun may be much stronger than believed by the IPCC.
Here is a plot of the low cloud cover against the cosmic radiation, and you can see the very high relationship. Well, this is not included in the IPCC reports, yet it's been in the literature for at least 10 years now. And there was a bit of a flurry when somebody leaked the next draft of the report in which they claim that they're talking about this, but when you actually read it, they're not including it at all.
And they actually downgraded in the last AR4 report the role of the sun by a factor of 7 instead of increasing the solar input into the models.
So they're saying up to 1950, the sun explains over 50% of temperature variation, and then suddenly, in around 1950, it's CO2. But how can that be? It's just simply illogical, but they're 90% certain about this, as they say in their report.
The whole modus operandi of the IPCC is to demonstrate that human-caused global warming is a bad thing. Now, Svensmark's theory does not fit into that paradigm. So, until recently, there was no mention whatsoever of Svensmark's theory. In fact, when Svensmark first started bringing out some of his results, the chairman of the IPCC actually said that he was being irresponsible and naive, because he said that so-called deniers would jump on this and use this as evidence that this human-caused global warming paradigm was wrong. So Svensmark's got a lot of grief for this.
The general idea that we are working on in order to explain this connection between solar activity and climate is, it actually starts in deep space with the acceleration of tiny particles. And these particles, they are accelerated to enormous energies and they rain down on our Earth. The idea is that these particles are responsible for producing clouds in our atmosphere. And the connection to solar activity is that the sun's magnetic field actually is like a shield against these particles that come from outer space. So when the sun is very active, it shields against these cosmic rays. And we have fewer clouds. And fewer clouds actually means a warmer Earth. Whereas if the sun is not very active, we get more particles entering into the atmosphere. It produces more clouds and we get a colder climate. That is the fundamental idea in the cosmic ray theory. The role of cosmic rays when they enter into the atmosphere, they actually ionize. That means that they split electrons from the atoms, so you get charges moving around. And these charges, we think that they are helping producing what we call the cloud condensation nuclei. In order to get a cloud in the Earth's atmosphere, you need a particle that the water vapor can condense on. If you don't have these particles, you will not have clouds as we see them. So you have these small particles that are floating in the air, and we call them cloud condensation nuclei. The idea is that cosmic rays can change the number of cloud condensation nuclei and therefore change the properties of clouds. So by changing the cosmic rays, we are changing the microphysics of clouds. We change the microphysics of clouds, we change the temperature on Earth.
The misconception that there's disagreement about the science has been deliberately created by a relatively small group of people.
There are many thousands of scientists who have signed, for example, the Oregon Petition Project that expressly denies that there is persuasive scientific evidence that human emissions of CO2 and other greenhouse gases are causing or will in the foreseeable future cause dangerous global warming.
One of the die-hard arguments is the idea that all scientists agree that there's this huge consensus. And that just doesn't hold up. You go to Geologic Congress in Norway in 2008, 2/3 of the presenters were skeptical, hostile, and dismissive of the United Nations climate view. In the case of the American Meteorological Society, the governing board got together, 24 or so members, issued a statement in line with the United Nations. Then they did it. Someone had the guts to do an internal survey of the actual meteorologists. Up to 75% called global warming a hoax, rejected it outright, or didn't accept the UN climate view of global warming. 75% of the rank and file scientists in the organization that endorsed the climate view rejected it. But that's used in the media. All of these tens of thousands of scientists agree. No, they don't. 24 governing board members with input or direct vote of its members politically decided on a statement. And then if you actually survey the members, it's the exact opposite. And so all it has to do is anyone who does the most basic, simple, and fundamental research can find out why we call this the climate con.
The 3,000 best scientists in the world from 113 countries have issued 4 unanimous reports saying we've got to deal with it.
Many people think that 2,500 scientists associated with the IPCC have endorsed the view that global warming is dangerous. That number, in fact, is not a list of endorsers. I got in touch with the Secretariat of the IPCC and asked for the names of those 2,500 because I wanted to follow up with them to see exactly what they thought. Well, the answer that came back from the IPCC first was that the names were confidential. At the time, they were confidential, so I couldn't have them. But also, they said that those were not endorsers. They were merely peer reviewers, people who had read one or more of the chapters that the IPCC produced in one of their mammoth studies.
This is not by any means a matter of 2,500 scientists all agreeing on such and such. In fact, many of the scientists who are co-authors of the many articles that are reviewed and represented in the assessment reports actually disagree very seriously with the UN IPCC.
The UN IPCC.
The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change.
Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change.
The IPCC.
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 IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change.
The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change of the United Nations, although they claim to be non-biased, objective group, has come with an agenda.
And this is the group, by the way, that they argue is the consensus that proves that climate change is occurring. In fact, most of the people on the IPCC are bureaucrats. There are very few actual scientists.
The IPCC does contain people who are skeptics on the extent of man's role in climate change. They get most of their work in the document, but it rarely is reflected in the summary for policymakers.
Expert reviewers like myself can be experts from all over the world. They're not necessarily the authors of the final report. They are people who contribute, who give information which the authors then can choose to ignore or use. But there have been instances where actual authors of reports have had their own contributions ignored.
Oh, if you look at the IPCC, which is, we're told is a scientific organization, it's sheer nonsense. It's a political organization.
The IPCC is nothing more than a political body masquerading as a scientific body.
The IPCC was formed as essentially a political organization.
The IPCC is this international climate panel, and they make a report every few years where they try to synthesize all climate science and then make some summary for policymakers. And I mean, I see the whole IPCC as more of a political game. I don't think it's very important for science.
Every report has what it calls a summary for policymakers. It's actually a summary by policymakers.
The summary for policymakers is designed to support the global warming alarmist agenda. It is not designed to accurately and fully represent the science in the report.
And I've always felt the summary report was written before the research was actually done.
It's supposed to be a summary of the science, but what happens is politicians go in, look at the science, and cut what they don't like.
In the science report, they tell you what's wrong with their data. They tell you all the limitations of it. But they know the media and the public are never going to read that. That's why they put the summary out before they release the science report. Because the summary is very different than what they're telling you in the science report. And it's a deliberate deception.
Trillions are involved in the oil and gas industry in protecting the idea that somehow global warming is not man-made or even doesn't exist. That's where the trillions of dollars are.
A new investigation by Mother Jones magazine has revealed that ExxonMobil has spent at least $8 million funding a network of groups to challenge the existence of global warming.
So they have a weak scientific case, so what are they left with? Attacking and smearing their enemies and trying to show that they're evil people who are working against the public interest because they're going to get rich off it. Well, if I were going to get rich, I would find something to do besides this.
So I'm not doing it for my pocketbook, and that's, of course, been the attack. And that's why they say, oh, you're paid by the oil companies. We never received a nickel.
The global warming extremists talk about how big oil funds the counterattack, the skeptical movement against global warming. There isn't any funding by big oil. There's no money coming in. This isn't happening.
My wife always asks me, well, when's that first payment from an oil company going to arrive?
At the end of the day, the big money has been behind the global warming agenda, the big corporate money. The BP and Shell, two European oil companies, are very heavily promoting either cap and trade or a carbon tax.
Let me first say that Shell as a company is actually very much advocating that we need a price for carbon on a worldwide basis.
Today, even ExxonMobil is promoting and lobbying for a carbon tax because they have figured out how they can make money off it.
When the oil companies support these initiatives, maybe that gives people a reason to begin to question whether it's legitimate. It's a matter of business now. It's not a matter of science. It's become a matter of business.
The science is now largely funded by the federal government, and in other countries, it's largely funded by the government. And so the scientists who get funded are the scientists who are on board with the agenda.
Unless you mention something about climate, your chances of being funded by the federal government are much reduced, especially at NASA.
If you're a scientist and you want to study climate change, you'll get funding. So long as your study is something along the lines of, I want to study how climate change has caused the glaciers to melt in Mexico. Plenty of funding for you. You're a scientist who says, climate change has been blamed for melting glaciers in Mexico. I don't believe that's true, and here's why. I need funding to prove that. No funding is forthcoming. Skeptics don't get the funding.
So you're just not going to get the funding to study these other causes. You can do it on your own time, but it's hard to work for nothing.
So you're looking at roughly 1,000 times, maybe a couple thousand times more money for those climate campaigners than what we global warming disaster skeptics are getting. And yet we are the ones who are portrayed as being the Goliaths, the financial Goliaths in all of this.
And I guess the other part, I've been a scientist since, almost 50 years now, and a lot of my young colleagues just won't talk about the issue because they're really, if they don't, get on the climate warming bandwagon, then they feel like they're not going to get support for their research. This is a very serious problem.
We have a political movement here that the green movement, environmental concern, has largely been hijacked and is now working for some kind of political settlement, which has very little to do with the environment. In fact, this whole global warming farrago is sucking all the air and oxygen and energy out from genuine environmental problems. There are genuine problems which should be dealt with.
It is a fact of life that the environmental movement has spent the last 40 years creating for itself an image, a public image, that they are small organizations with a lot of volunteer activists who are idealistic and only have the world's good at heart. And yet, in fact, of course, these are mammoth organizations which are mostly concerned, as far as I can tell, with political power and the use of political power.
There's stages in movements. You have a movement that is first has good intentions and comes from the grassroots and comes from the people. At some point, if it's successful, it has a lobbying impact and then a political impact, and then it becomes a business, and then it becomes an industry. And when it goes through those stages, it loses its morality. It loses its focus and its way of why it is that it was doing what it was doing in the first place. And it becomes a self-sustaining entity that exists not to solve the problems that those in the grassroots that started it in the first place intended to solve, but to perpetuate itself and perpetuate its own power.
Now you have groups like Nature Conservancy who have multi-billion-dollar annual budgets. When you have a business the way that you perpetuate your business is to produce what is required. And in this case, the environmental movement is saying that there are problems. If there are no problems, there's no reason for your business to continue. So the environmental movement has to become shriller and shriller and shriller.
I think the environmental movement has been hijacked. But the hijacking has occurred really because of the foundations. It used to be that the environmental movement was very diverse. Then what happened was the foundations started to organize among themselves, and they became the activists. They decided what the agenda should be for the environmental movement. And then they dictated terms to environmentalists. They said, if you want funding, here's what our priority is this year. Well, soon global warming became the priority of the foundations.
These people stole the moral high ground, and they present it as if only they care about the environment, only they care about the world, the planet, and the future. And the rest of us have got to smarten up and listen to them, otherwise we're in a lot of trouble. Well, that's an outrage. And a lot of people say, well, I don't fully understand environmentalism and all the ramifications of it, but yeah, I don't want to dirty my planet. I don't want to soil my back step. Why would I want to do that?
I think that we all want to preserve the natural environment, but you can either do that on the basis of sound science and logic, or you can do it on the basis of hysteria and emotionalism.
It is estimated that the environmental extremist lobby is worth $4 to $5 billion, or they spend $4 to $5 billion a year on pushing environmental extremism here in the United States and around the world. And the question is, could that $4 to $5 billion be better spent by trying to alleviate poverty, by trying to get developing economies on that first rung of economic development?
Every day, if you look around the globe, 400 to 500 people, many of them children, die because they drink polluted water, contaminated water. For what the cost of the Kyoto Protocol, what that would cost for 1 year, we could in perpetuity provide safe drinking water for the world. So that's a choice that we're making. And why are we making the choice for global warming? At least one argument is, well, that's something that's going to affect us, might affect us, when we know this other thing is affecting people every day, but they're halfway around the world.
And that's what's happening right now. And you have people like James Cameron, who lives in literally, you can look at the pictures of Bel Air, double mansions next to each other, fly down to Brazil, stop a hydroelectric dam from being built that the leftist president Lula supports. He goes down there with Sigourney Weaver and then flies home back to his palaces after stopping running water and electricity for millions of people in Brazil. That is obscene, that is immoral, and ultimately it is fundamentally racist.
Well, the money dedicated to global warming is all wasted. And it not only is wasted, but it actually does active harm.
The problem with their wrong policies is that it has impacts on real lives.
Until Washington, Paris, London, Rotterdam level their cities and return them to swamps, wetland, and jungles, that we had no business telling them how they should develop so-called sustainably and in harmony with the earth. Well, the bottom line is they are living in harmony with the earth. And harmony with the earth, when humans live in harmony with the earth, it's death, disease, poverty, misery, and short life expectancy and filth.
These climate change alarmists claim that they are concerned about human health and human lives and environmental quality, but what they're doing is just the opposite.
I think many people who advocate for global warming policy do have good intentions. They really believe that human emissions of CO2 are driving dangerous global warming. They really believe that these policies can reduce that warming and prevent some of the danger. I'm very sure that as far as motive is concerned, the vast majority of them are perfectly well intended about all of this. But as you know, hell is paved with good intentions. And having good intentions doesn't guarantee good results.
These countries have every right to develop as we did. And to have us say, well, you can do it, we'll help you, we're gonna meddle in your affairs to make sure you do it correct, that's a new form of colonialism. White power structure in Western Europe and the United States is telling people of color how they can do things, regulating how they can do it while they die, while their infant mortality continues to skyrocket. We're denying them life-saving carbon-based energy.
Government action in the global climate change thing is harmful and has been harmful. I've recommended to Congress that they immediately remove all funding for global warming.
These risks have to be weighed against each other. It's not just that, you're not willing to spend this money to save the planet. No, I'm not willing to jeopardize the lives of all these millions of people in order to address your hypothetical threat. They're living in a real life-shortening threat situation right now.
There's no cost-benefit analysis that is reasonably done here in this environmental movement. It seems that most of the prescriptions that are made end up doing more harm than good. They should be asking themselves, are we doing more harm than good? And they simply are not. They've bought into this paradigm. They've drunk the Kool-Aid and they're going to follow it all the way. Doesn't matter who gets in the way or who gets hurt. For Americans, at least, the pain is going to be higher prices. You may have to change your diet. You may not be able to eat as much of what you want or as much. But for other people who are living on the edge of poverty, where the next meal is uncertain, decisions that are made because of environmental prerogatives are life and death questions for them.
I think the moral high ground should be occupied by those of us who are opposing the energy rationing agenda. But in fact, the mainstream media continually presents it as a good versus bad story, where the people who want to increase energy poverty are the good guys, and the people who are fighting for abundant energy and prosperity are the bad guys.
If you look back at the history of the IPCC, it was formed by a man named Maurice Strong, who was a bureaucrat who wanted one world government, and he wanted to use the threat of climate change as the force through which he could tax the rich nations that were producing CO2 through burning fossil fuels and use that money for the poor nations and build this one world government.
How did it become politics? The hemisphere doesn't know Republicans from Democrats. Science should not know Republicans from Democrats.
It's a matter of doing good or bad science, we're all striving to do good science.
In science, we're supposed to seek out people who disagree with us, because if we have a diversity of opinion, ultimately it's going to help us to the final truth. But that's not what's happening. What's happening is dissent is being suppressed for political means.
Al Gore's propaganda. He wants you to bathe together. He wants you to ride your bike to work. They want you to take city transit. They want you to have a wholesale change in your lifestyle. And by the way, Al Gore and Leonardo DiCaprio walked out on that stage when Al Gore won the Nobel Prize in 2007 in Hollywood. And when they walked out, it flashed on the screen, "Take public transit as a way to lower your carbon footprint." Well, I posit one question. When was the last time Al Gore or Leonardo DiCaprio was seen on a city bus trying to save carbon emissions?
Well, I think people need to be more circumspect.
I think most people probably don't have the time to investigate everything that comes across the news. You reach a level where it's on the news a lot, you start to accept it.
So people should look themselves and not rely on what is in the newspapers and on the media, which is grossly exaggerated.
All I'm saying is, look, all you've heard is one side, and you should hear the other side and draw your own conclusions.
When I first started writing about global warming deniers, there was a great deal of reluctance to speak out. They often would speak only off the record. They were very hesitant when they spoke. That's really quite changed. More and more are now willing to speak. I think they see that the tide is turning.
People who were afraid to speak out about different things are finding voice. They're libeled, smeared, and denigrated by the media and the institutions. But they're finding voice, they're becoming more confident and more bold in speaking up. And that's what's happening in science.
Scientific, technological elite.